Hello, my name is Clark Massey. I've been working at Simple House for 10 years, and before that I was at a homeless soup line and volunteering in a homeless shelter in addition to that, and I lived with the homeless in a Catholic worker house. I've experienced the homelessness over the last 10 years. I work with a variety of people who aren't homeless also, but I guess I've just been around homelessness a lot, both in the Washington, D.C. area, in the Kansas City, Missouri area. I've visited homeless outreaches in other major cities. This does not make me an academic on the subject. It does not make me the last word on the subject, but I've been around it enough that I have quite a few opinions and observations that I think are reasonably valid and should be considered. And so I want to talk about what is homelessness and what's going on in America with homelessness. I don't think that the sound bites you get from the media adequately give an understanding of it. First off, what is it? Homelessness technically is just not being on a lease. It does not mean you don't have a place to stay. It doesn't mean you don't even have your own bedroom. Some people are homeless, and they do. And what we'll see go into a project neighborhood, and you'll meet people who are just sleeping on their girlfriend's couch or living with their girlfriend, but they're homeless because they're not married to the person, they're not on a lease, they have no residence to call their own, they have no official domicile. We'll also meet homeless who are mothers with kids, and they're not homeless in the sense that they're on the street and you have this idea of this cardboard box with this mom with children in it. They're homeless in the sense that they stay with their aunt. So they're even staying with family, but they're on the rolls with the U.S. government to get housing subsidies or move into a project neighborhood or somehow get housing assistance because they have no technical place to go. And even people in these situations, which the government considers homeless, will ask for homelessness letters from an organization like us or from someone else just to prove that they're homeless, to show that they don't have a lease or have a normal domicile or regular shelter, and we'll do that. So there's probably even people watching this video who are technically homeless. And just to consider that when you hear homelessness figures, when you hear people signing up for housing subsidies, these are not all people living on the street or in a homeless shelter. That's not true. That's not all what homelessness is. Having said that, there's quite a few people living on the street in homeless shelters who you would not recognize. When I first started working with the homeless, we had a Catholic worker house, which was just a residential house in Washington, D.C. It was probably illegal because it was a residential house. And we ran a soup line out of it. The soup line, when I joined it, had been going on 15 years. It had like an industrial kitchen in this row house. And 3 mornings a week, we fed more than 100 people those morning, and gave shelter to 7-8 guys living in the house at different times. It had been much bigger than that, all just in this residential setting. Well, a lot of the guys who we served, I just knew them. I knew them on a first name basis, and I would drive down, like, say, 14th Street, Adams Morgan in D.C., DuPont Circle area, see them walking down the street. And when you've known people for a while, you start to figure out the telltale signs of what homelessness looks like. And oftentimes homelessness looks like a guy who's 40 wearing a hoodie, carrying a backpack. Totally clean, haircut fine, everything about, he doesn't look raggedy at all. It's just how many guys who are 40, choose to wear a sweatshirt that they appear to have nothing to do with the, whatever's on the front of it, and carry backpacks. Just not many, And a lot of the guys who I would recognize, who I already knew were homeless, from working in the soup kitchen and knew their background and things like that, were these guys. So there's a lot more homeless walking down the street than you would necessarily think, because some of them are well-groomed and well-put-together people. Having said that, when I worked with the homeless, they would use a term amongst themselves to describe what they called the hardcore homeless. And hardcore homeless is what we think of when we think of people living in a cardboard box, pushing a shopping cart. In Kansas City, There's people who live down near the river or sleep under a bridge. These are the people who we call the hardcore homeless, and in DC there was a lot of them who slept on top of grates because there's a lot of heating grates. And a lot of them never come inside, and that's what kind of qualifies them as hardcore homeless. And some of them, particularly the homeless who are just, as I was saying before, walking down the street, clean, whatever, a lot of them are employed. A lot of them are waiters, painters, cooks. Having said that they're employed, there's typically a reason like drug addiction that they're not able to make their ends meet, but they're kind of like, I don't know if you'd call it a functional drug addict or not if you're homeless, but they're functional in the sense that you could carry on a conversation with them for 15 minutes and never realize that they're homeless, never realize that they have anything else going on, that there's a drug addiction or anything. So of these hardcore homeless, I would create 3 distinctions. I didn't really come up with these distinctions. The homeless guy told them to me, and as far as I can tell, they're absolutely right. There are people who are, and these overlap, but there's people who are mentally ill, people who have drug addiction, severe drug addiction, and people who are running from the law. So mentally ill are kind of the most interesting case to me. There's some of the mental illnesses we've seen are like schizoaffective disorder, personality dissociation disorder. I don't even know what some of the other things we've seen are really. An example of this is there was a woman who was always sleeping under a pile of blankets out on the street, always in this nook, and you'd go up there and, she'd never ask you for money. If you gave her money, she'd take it. She loved to take cigarettes or anything like that if you give them to her. And she was well-spoken. She was extremely well-read. And she turned away help. You said, "Oh, do you need help? Do you know where the shelters are?" Yes, they know where the shelters are. Do you know where the soup lines are? Yes, they know where the soup lines are. They're plugged in way more than most people, plugged in better than you are just by looking at the internet. And we asked her, like, what are you doing? Like, can we help you? Can we help you find a place to stay or what? And she'd be like, well, my sister's coming down to get me, in a couple weeks I'm not going to be homeless. A couple weeks later, you've been seeing her, visiting with her every couple days, and her sister's never come. Oh, sister's been delayed. Another week goes by, and this goes on and on until finally there has to be this admission, and you're offering to loan her your phone so she can call this said sister, and this sister's not coming. There's been no communication, but she's pushing away help. Another example of pushing away help is in Washington, D.C., I was very touched. I saw a guy digging through a trash can for food, and that's just not necessary. There's so much food and soup kitchens for the homeless. That type of behavior is not because of someone was driven to that by hunger. That type of behavior is from mental illness. And I gave this guy a $20 bill, and he looked at me like I had 2 heads, and he pushed it away and kind of hustled away, and that's kind of typical with this mentally ill homeless population. There's like a long building of trust that needs to happen. Maybe at some point I'd like to interview a psychiatrist for this podcast about how the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill kind of helped create this problem of mentally ill homeless. And another person I met, also kind of pushing away help, I talked to him in the park. He had an apartment. He had everything that he needed, but he would not go to his apartment because he believed it was bugged and that people were breaking into his apartment when he wasn't there, and so he thought it was unsafe. And I said, but right now you're sleeping in the park with a cart. Do you think that this is more safe than an apartment? And he goes, I know if someone told me that, I would think that was weird too. But yes, this is more safe than my apartment. Another situation that I bear in mind with the mental illness is when I was at the Catholic Worker, we had a guy who was so well spoken, so together. He seemed like he just lacked so little to just make life great. And I think he'd lived a very normal life and something had happened and he'd gotten a divorce and he became homeless. And I don't think he'd ever worked. I think his wife had been supporting him before the divorce. And after knowing him only 6 to 8 months, did it finally come out that the helicopters flying overhead are the CIA bugging him and he's got something implanted in his brain. Like the mental illness was like so well hidden that we kept just thinking like, man, this guy's totally together, except maybe he's just lazy, or we can't figure out why he's not pulling it together, you know. But it really took, you know, over 6 months of intensively working with him, knowing him well, you know, talking with him all the time when he finally confessed that what he believes is happening to him, like the conspiracy theories and the paranoia he has. And it blew me away because I had so many serious conversations with him up to that point, and not that I shouldn't have, but I just hadn't had any clue that was like part of the root problem. Besides the mentally ill, overlapping with it a little bit, but it does seem distinct, is drug addiction. There's a lot of hardcore drug addiction amongst the homeless. Alcohol is ruining as many lives as all the other drugs combined. And it's usually multiple drugs. And it's a choice that you want to, you know, live in the park, live on the street, sleep outside, whatever, because you can drink all day. And most of these people know exactly where the shelters are. There are enough beds in the shelter to fit them, but they're choosing not to go. And they're choosing not to go because you can't, you know, open a 24-pack of beer at 9 o'clock in the shelter. You have to follow certain rules, you know. And so a lot of some people will go through that, you know, people who are more borderline or what, but these hardcore homeless would prefer to lay outside and drink or use than submit to any type of structure like that. And it's tragic. I mean, I know multiple homeless people who literally have loving homes to go back to if only they will stop using, and they won't, you know. Even if they just won't. So there's a lot of maybe things to be said about that, but I can't even think where to begin on it. But it's a large part of the homeless population. It's just a reality when working with the homeless, and it's one of the reasons why you don't want to give out cash. A third group of people are people who are running from the law. And what does it mean, say, to be running from the law in this case? The people who I've been able to verify that this is like the case, like why they're actually homeless, is typically they are in a parole type situation where maybe they were incarcerated and put at in Kansas City it's called the Honor Center, where you live a fairly normal life, work for a job, blah, 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 but you have certain rules. You have to not take drugs, you have to be in by a certain hour, you have to do this, or you get sent back to prison. Well, if you did take drugs and you don't want to be sent back to prison, you don't go back to the Honor Center. So there have been a number of people who are homeless who, they're not necessarily that serious of criminals or anything, but they just did not go back to the Honor Center. They cannot go get a driver's license. They cannot qualify for food stamps. They cannot do any of these things to get normal government services because they have warrants out for their arrest. And they're homeless, and they're in the homeless populations. And typically they do want to drink and drug, but it just doesn't seem like it's the causal factor in their homelessness. The causal factor appears to be that they're just on the lam. So that may not be quite as scary as it first sounds, that there's a bunch of homeless people who are running from the law, but there's a bunch of homeless people who cannot get straight with the law. And they usually won't admit it at first. Or if they do admit it, it's always for some innocuous crime that doesn't seem that important to you at first, like I didn't pay my child support or something. It takes a while to get to know people well enough where they actually say what's going on and why they won't agree to go get their food stamps or what. But if they're showing a lot of resistance to go get food stamps or to help themselves just through the normal system, it's a sign there's probably warrants or something in play. So that's a general introduction, and I've got a homelessness part 2 where I want to talk about people panhandling, the situation with soup lines and homeless shelters, and how the police are dealing with the homeless and issues like that. So thank you very much.